Dating abuse can happen in teenage relationships. Before reaching adulthood, 1 in 3 teenagers will experience some form of abuse by their partner. This makes dating abuse extremely common, but it's often overlooked as a serious issue. This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm releasing part two of the interview I conducted with Shari Genser. I am an attorney with Ross and Colandrillo, a divorce and family law firm in Mountainside, New Jersey. In this episode, we discuss what protections are in place for teenage victims of abuse, why victims sometimes drop restraining orders, and how difficult it may be for teenagers to come forward about sexual abuse. But before you listen, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us break the silence surrounding domestic violence. So, teen dating violence is a difficult and tricky issue because, number one, depending on the age of the victim and abuser, they may not qualify for the restraining order
Yeah.
protection that's available through the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act and through our family courts. They may not even know what
Wow.
domestic violence is. They may have never been exposed to the idea of the cycle of power and control.
Hmm.
And I'm going to say this in a gendered way. I know that it's not a fully gendered issue, but I know for myself as a young girl, if I go back to being a teenager, and if there was a boy that was giving me attention, that felt good. And you are oftentimes, as a young girl, on a social scene where other girls may have boyfriends, and the idea of being in a dating relationship is a cool thing or
Yeah.
something that they aspire to have. I think I was like 12 when I
Yeah.
first had a boyfriend, for whatever that's worth, right? Now, thankfully, I didn't marry the boy that I was dating at age 12. But the idea of being in a relationship is something that is romanticized in Disney films and
Yeah.
whatever else. And so we're kind of that shoved down our throat at a very young age. And the idea
Hmm.
of coupling off is a very romanticized idea. So
Oh,
if
yeah.
someone then pays attention to you, the attention at first may feel very good. But
Hmm.
if it goes beyond, like, let's hang out and go to the school dance, to starting to pull you away from friends and family and activities
Yes.
and having that control over your life, there's a fine line between what's a healthy dating relationship and what is not. So the
Hmm.
red flags are really tied to that coercive control notion of separating you from friends and family, maybe telling you what to wear, what not to wear, what
Yeah.
activities to participate in, who to hang out with, who not to hang out with. Because again, domestic violence in the teen setting is not going to be an old married couple getting into a physical altercation behind the
Right.
closed doors of their home,
Hmm.
but it is still at its core the exercise of power and control by one partner over another. And in
Right.
some instances, it may be that a young victim of domestic violence is willfully engaging in some level of sexual conduct, but where is
Hmm.
the line drawn? Where does it go
Mm.
from sexual experimentation to sexual abuse?
Oh,
Where
interesting.
does it go from a voluntary, let's spend a lot of time together, to a young person being told, you're going to come with me every day after school? And it is a
Hmm.
complex issue because, as I said, young people want to be grown-ups. They
Yeah.
want to be in romantic relationships and they want to be cool. And so it is a fine line to draw between what is and what is not a healthy relationship. And
Mm.
some are not getting great models for healthy relationships, whether that's from, the celebrity people that we follow
Hmm.
online or from their own parents and family relationships that they see in the elder generations.
Yeah.
So, in the worst cases of teen dating violence, there's physical violence, and you're dealing with a 16-year-old who's getting physically assaulted by her romantic partner. Those are, I'm not going to say they're the easy ones, but they're the easy ones to spot because
Right.
you can see a
Hmm.
physical injury. It's the ones where there is a more sort of insidious and underlying, not outwardly visible level
Right.
of power and control being exercised it's dangerous because it can very quickly spiral from the emotional abuse into physical abuse.
abuse. And
Mm-hmm.
so the goal of trying to educate young people about teen dating violence, about what is and is not a healthy relationship, at least for my fellowship project when I worked at Legal Services, was to just put the language in their head
Yeah.
that there is a such thing as a healthy relationship and that
Mm.
there is a such thing as an unhealthy relationship. And that as
Mm-hmm.
young people, we can stop and say, does that attention feel good? Maybe, but is it healthy for me to be engaged in this relationship? Are the things that I'm either being told to do or not to do, or the things that I'm participating in, are they good for me? Or am I going along with something because I'm getting pressure from somebody that I want to provide me with love?
It's very interesting because I think when you break it down into these concrete examples, you can see that obviously power and control can happen at any age. And we know
Mm-hmm.
that 1 in 3 teenagers will experience dating abuse before they reach adulthood. So it is extremely prevalent. So I think giving these, or rather offering some of these concrete examples is really, really helpful. You mentioned something that I want to follow up about, the sexual abuse piece. Do you have more examples of, for instance, when it is, yeah, normal experimentation versus more of a sexual abuse territory? Do you have any examples of that?
I think what I'll say is it's a very charged topic.
Yeah.
And what
Yeah.
is voluntary sexual experimentation for one teenager may not be the same as for another teenager
Mm.
because different family values, different
Yeah.
experiences in your early childhood may
Mhm.
result in someone saying, this is fine. If you have someone, for example, when I was working with the sort of more impoverished community, meaning at legal services, working with people who were below the poverty line and qualified for free legal assistance, these were sometimes young adults who had been abused in their childhood.
Right.
And so the idea of sexual activity was less taboo for them. They had already been exposed to it in a not healthy way.
Hmm.
So then the sexual experimentation when they're a young teenager was just, this is what people do. Whereas depending on what background you might have had growing up, it might have been less normalized for a
Yeah.
different young adult.
Hmm.
So the the restraining orders that I deal with in family court, even the adult victims, oftentimes victims don't want to talk about the sexual abuse.
Yeah.
So you take away the sort of layer of maturity of a victim being an adult and having lived a certain amount of life, and you bring them down to 14, 15,
Yeah.
16 years old. They're not going to run around and want to talk about this. Or they
Mm-mm.
may not even see it as abuse because sometimes it's, I'm dating this person and this is what he or she wants from me, and I'm happy to
Yeah.
provide it because then it makes me feel loved. They will
Yeah.
give me love if I give them this. And
Or it's just
so,
this is what you do or something.
yeah, right.
Oh,
And so the question is, does every teenager who has sex with their partner then qualify as a victim of teen dating violence? I don't think so.
right.
But if a young person is engaging in sexual activity because they're being forced and they're
Yes.
not quite comfortable with it, and then there's
Yeah.
added layers of social isolation or maybe threats of physical harm if you don't engage in the sexual
Right.
activity,
Right.
that's where it gets more dangerous. That's where I would call that teen dating violence as opposed to sexual experimentation. It is a very difficult area. And I now have a 3-year-old daughter, so I'm scared about what comes in,
Yeah.
8 to 10 years for us.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that you bring up because I forget the exact statistic, but I think it's something of like over 60% of teens don't talk to their parents about like their relationships, their romantic relationships, because, it's awkward. They
Mhm.
don't feel comfortable. They feel they can't go to them. And that's even just general relationships. And then if abuse is happening, and then you think about talking then about having to say to your parents, like, this sexual abuse is happening, the reaction they might have, like what you're going to do. I think it just makes it a very taboo subject. But I am kind of curious because you said a little bit earlier that there are potentially based on age, no or maybe little protections for teenagers. Can you do
So
something legally?
there is, but it is the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act that allows a victim to individually file a restraining order against their abuser in family court does have these age
Oh,
limitations.
okay.
So for under 18 victims, where the defendant is also the under
Yeah.
age 18 category, you're dealing with something where the victim would have to report it to law enforcement,
Hmm.
and law enforcement would have to refer it to the prosecutor's office for a juvenile delinquency proceeding.
Okay.
And there are, the assault and battery laws and sexual assault laws and harassment laws. All of those crimes are crimes whether you're an adult or a child,
Right.
but there's a different area of our criminal justice system that addresses
Gotcha.
juveniles who engage in criminal activity versus adults who engage in criminal activity. And the idea of a civil restraining order is just not available depending on the age of the victim and the defendant. So I definitely
Interesting.
dealt with cases at legal services where there had been prior juvenile delinquency proceedings against the defendant. He then aged out, kept acting up, and with
Mm.
the same victim, then ended up in my office with a temporary restraining order. I'm representing the victim, and the prior juvenile delinquency proceeding is out there as prior history.
Okay.
So it wasn't the idea of a temporary and a final restraining order wasn't available when he was under 18. And then the victim did ultimately file a restraining order at a later date
Hmm.
because the behavior continued. So the juvenile delinquency proceeding, and not to divulge too much information about
Right.
that one client, but there was a proceeding. He was then given some sort of probationary term.
Hmm.
There was a limitation on contact by virtue of the delinquency proceeding against him, but it wasn't a permanent restraining order. And
Mm.
what I find so complicated about all domestic violence cases, but the young people in particular, is there's kind of this dangerous dance where maybe the victim is still engaging with the defendant in some way or with the abuser in some way
Right.
because it is intimate partner violence. This is just a stranger who walks down the street and
Right.
smacks you with, a brick.
Hmm.
There is a relationship between the parties. And so it's
Yeah.
often a very gray area of, was the victim reinitiating contact? I have dealt with cases where the victim is like 2 seconds over the age of 18. So the parents are very involved in communicating with my office, communicating with
Yeah.
me, and you have to carve out, this is my client and her wishes are going to control. Same thing when I have a young adult defendant in a
Hmm.
DV who may be 18 years and 2 seconds old. The parents want to be
Yeah.
very involved in the discussions. And when you have the young adults and it's sort of a harassment style, emotional abuse fact pattern,
Yeah.
the court system is ill equipped to deal with that.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that's just the reality. So you'll have a
Yeah.
prosecutor who says, all right, you've been charged with assaulting your girlfriend and we'll put you on some sort of probationary term. The charges will be dismissed if you behave yourself for a couple months. If then that relationship re-engages and then there's further acts, either they're back in front of a juvenile delinquency court or they're ultimately ending up as adult defendants in a DV matter.
Yeah, and that is tricky what you say about the courts. I know somebody who was trying to file a restraining order, then went back to the partner, and I feel the courts also response sometimes is almost like, well, why would you do that if this? You know what I mean? And there's
Sure.
not that human element sometimes.
And let me say this,
Yeah.
victims can't violate their own restraining orders ever.
Hmm.
The TRO process restricts the defendant. But if, as the victim, you are shown to have sent a text message, made a phone call, invited
Hmm.
contact in some way, it absolutely undercuts your credibility as to
Yeah.
whether there is a need for permanent protection. And the judges who
Mm.
deal with these cases and see this as a revolving door of victims who
Yeah.
file and dismiss, file, get a final,
Yeah.
and then dismiss, it is never, from a legal perspective, a valid reason to deny a final restraining order if a victim has reinitiated contact, but it's a fact that the judge will consider. So,
Mhm.
legally speaking, a practice pointer for either an attorney or a victim who's going through this, you can't violate your own restraining order. And the fact that you've reconciled with
Interesting.
your abuser does not undercut your need for protection if there is another act of abuse. But what
Huh.
sometimes happens is there is an act of abuse which may be more physical in nature.
Hmm.
And then if the restraining order is either not filed at that time or filed and dismissed, and then the later acts of abuse are more of a harassment, a post-separation abuse, it can be harder to obtain a restraining order on harassment allegations than, for example, physical abuse,
Right,
because a
right.
photo of a black eye or of a broken, a picture of a broken bone, an x-ray,
Hmm.
those types of evidence are very compelling to a judge.
Hmm.
Whereas maybe a series of text messages where somebody calls you a nasty word and maybe you call them a nasty word is less compelling in some instances.
Hmm.
So the, file and drop cycle is partly because victims get exhausted from the system.
Yeah.
They have financial considerations about the children.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's just that they've taken off 5 days from work and they've
Yeah.
appeared in court to file it, to go to the police station, to go to the first court date, and then he retains an attorney so it's adjourned, or he doesn't show up for the first date so that it's adjourned.
Yep.
And again, I'm using gendered, but this is men and women are victims and defendants in all of these
Yes.
cases.
Hmm.
There are so many reasons why somebody drops a restraining order.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's that I'm going to lose my job if I take off another day. I don't
Yeah.
have any more PTO. And yes, there are protections available for victims of domestic violence, but not every victim knows that.
Yeah. Or feels
Sometimes
comfortable
it's
saying it.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
not everybody wants to go to their employer and say the reason I didn't come to work is
Yeah.
because of this.
Yep.
So, so the pressure on, I think, the victim to proceed with a restraining order is you can't make that your focus. Go forward with the restraining order, otherwise you won't be taken seriously in the
Right.
future. But there is a really valid consideration for what does your case look like in the future
Yeah.
if you have filed and dismissed. And so from a strategic standpoint, when I'm presenting these cases at a trial and there has been a history of either no charges being filed or a TRO being filed and dismissed. And this, when I say charges, I'm referring to criminal charges
Right.
because there's the parallel proceedings of whether there's a criminal charge and a DBTRO filed at the same
Hmm.
time. The attorneys have to do a very good job of carefully walking through, laying the timeline and
Yeah.
establishing what happened when the first one wasn't pursued. Whether it was that nothing was ever brought to the court at all, or you decided as the victim, the survivor, to drop that TRO and give
Right.
a good reason to the judge for why are we here now?
Right.
Because most of the time, it's not that I just changed my mind and I want my TRO based on the old incident. It's
Right.
that happened in 2021. And then this happened in 2022. And then this happened in 2023. And yes, I dropped all three of those TROs. But now I'm here because more things are happening. And so the
Right.
presentation of the case, the advocacy for an attorney in these cases is so critical to say, from a legal position, you need to have a current reason for filing a TRO. And to
Yeah.
lay that history out is very important, but you're not getting a final restraining order if the predicate act itself is not sufficient to warrant the entry of a final restraining order. And so I've overcome that hurdle in many cases where, yes, there was filings and droppings or no filing, and you have this whole history of DV that was never reported.
Right.
Um, it's my job as an advocate is to educate the court and
Mhm.
to present my case in such a way that it's both legally and also in the specifics of this case irrelevant that there was 5 incidents that she didn't pursue a final restraining order with.
Right.
We're here today because of what happened in 2024, and this
Mhm.
TRO was filed based on this reason. And then you fill in the history to educate the court about the history between those parties. But um, it's not an easy thing to do for a victim to make the choice to leave. It's
Yeah.
not an easy thing for a victim to do to stick with that choice to
Mm-mm.
leave because
Yeah.
there's emotional pulls back into any domestic violence survivor, I think, will tell you that there was a time where they loved this person.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's a very difficult thing to overcome. And presenting that issue to the court, um, it just you have to be clear
Mhm.
about what it is that you're seeking and why now, and not
Mhm.
let it get muddied with all the stuff that's happened in the past. And that's where I think advocacy is so important in these cases where there has been a history of filing and dropping. Domestic violence at its core is an interpersonal problem. It's not a legal issue. It's an interpersonal societal problem that the
Mhm.
court system tries to address. And
Right.
so as an attorney, I will tell you a restraining order is not the end all be all for a
Mhm.
victim of domestic violence. They are useful tools, but a victim needs to understand what that victim needs. And maybe it's just cutting off contact and not seeing the person again. Maybe it truly is filing a restraining order.
Yeah.
Maybe it's settling the case with a private agreement to stay separate and apart for whatever the motivating factors are.
Mhm.
But my number one tip for, victims old and young, but particularly to the young people, is that you are in control of your life. You don't have to be in a relationship with someone who's being bad to you. You don't have to stay in a relationship with someone who's being bad to you. And you get to make decisions about what you do with your life and your body.
Yeah, and I think that's a wonderful reminder. And something we also say is if you're struggling with figuring out if you should leave or not, if your relationship's unhealthy or not, call JBWS. Safety planning is the most important thing because leaving can also be such a dangerous time. So,
Sure.
get involved with services. You don't have to be on the precipice of leaving to call us. It's always good to get educated about domestic violence, learn more, learn the services, just so that you make sure you're safe.
This information is for you and for someone you might know. Maybe it's
Yes.
not you who's in a relationship. Maybe it's your older brother, cousin, sister, aunt, uncle, mom, dad.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to just educate people. And the more that we as individuals know, maybe ourselves or someone we know can use that information in the future.
This completes our two-part series with Shari Genser. Thank you so much for sharing your legal expertise with our listeners. We are so grateful that you made the time to speak with me about such an important topic. And just as a note, next week will be our final weekly episode. In March, Unsilenced will be moving to a bi-weekly release schedule. But be sure to come back next week to learn more about all facets of abuse. These types of conversations are the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.